Hello friends, and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start as usual with the Namo Tassa. Feel free to join in if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, welcome everyone. Today we are starting a new series, and for the next few weeks or next few months maybe, we will talk about Buddhist conflict resolution strategies. So we will do that by studying a very famous conflict from the time of the Buddha, namely the conflict at Kosambi, or the schism at Kosambi. So there was an incident in the Buddha's time where a conflict got out of hand, and it got out of hand to the extent that the Bhikkhu Sangha was split into two parts. So there was a real schism in the Buddhist Sangha. And we will explore how the Buddha dealt with this, how the Sangha dealt with this, how the lay people dealt with this, what kind of strategies did they apply in order to try to create unity and harmony in the Sangha, and what happened and how it all developed, and how eventually the conflict was healed and the schism was healed and the Sangha was unified again. So this is a big topic, and we will explore this over the course of many weeks. And today is the session where we just try to get an overview over this conflict and try to understand a few basics of what happened. So in the Buddha's time, there were two major conflicts or two major schisms in the Sangha. And one of them is a very famous one. One of them is the schism that was caused by the Buddha's cousin, Devadatta. I think this is the one that most people will be familiar with and most people will think about when they hear about schism in the Sangha. So this is a case where somebody with malicious intent purposely split the Buddhist Sangha. In this case, Devadatta. So Devadatta was trying to take over control of the Sangha from the Buddha, and the Buddha refused. And then Devadatta purposely created that split and that schism and took a part of the Sangha and created his own Sangha. So he purposely damaged the Sangha, and eventually those monks were brought back and the schism was healed. And this is the kind of schism where traditionally in Buddhism we say, if you purposely damage the Sangha to this extent, this is what leads to immediate rebirth in hell. And so nowadays most people say if you create a schism in the Sangha, that will lead to rebirth in hell. But actually there is another type of schism, and the other type of schism is the one that happened at Kosambi, and the one that we are going to study in our series of in our sessions, in our course on Buddhist conflict resolution strategies now. And this is a case where people in the Sangha or the monks there are genuine practitioners. They really want to practice the Dhamma, but there is a disagreement on what actually is proper practice. And both sides genuinely think that they are practicing properly and that they are applying the teachings properly and that they are following Vinaya, so the monastic rules, properly. So everybody has good intentions. Everybody has wholesome motives for their actions, and still there is a conflict and still they cannot agree. And so how to deal with that? And I think this is actually very practical, very applicable also in modern times, not only back in the Buddha's day, and in our Buddhist circles, in our local practice communities, or even in our families, in our among our friends, or at the workplace, or any other place. we can often encounter this, that everybody who's there actually has some kind of good intentions. Actually, everybody wants to do the right thing, wants to try to be a good person. But for some reason, still there are conflicts and still people cannot agree on what is the right thing to do. So it's very interesting to see how the Buddha dealt with that and how the early Sangha and also the early lay people dealt with these kind of things. So in order to study this conflict, because this is a very big conflict and it went on for many, many months back in the Buddha's time. So we have a lot of texts about this conflict. We have a few very, very interesting sutta texts, especially in the Majjhima Nikaya, that we are going to have a look at, not today, but over the course of the next 2 weeks. One of them is the Kosambi Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 48. This contains teachings about communal harmony that the Buddha gave to those quarreling monks trying to reconcile them. So he talks about communal harmony, and he talks about 7 factors of stream entry. And this is a very unique teaching, especially those 7 factors of stream entry don't occur anywhere else in the canon. So it's a very interesting sutta to study. And then another one that the Buddha gave a little bit later, also trying to reconcile those monks, is the Upakilesa Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 128, which we're also going to read at some point. And this is also very beautiful. Buddha tries to reconcile those monks. When he fails again, he visits other communities that are practicing in a very harmonious way, very beautiful way. So we have more teachings on communal harmony. And those communities, because they are in harmony, can develop their practice and they reach very deep states of meditation. And so the Buddha is teaching about the upakilesas, so very subtle kilesas or subtle defilements of the mind that only occur in deep meditation. And again, this is very unique to this particular sutta, doesn't occur in other places. So it's, again, a very interesting sutta to study, also from a meditation or practice perspective. So these are suttas we are going to read. Besides the suttas, we also have other genres of text that deal with the Kosambi schism, especially, of course, Vinaya texts, because a schism obviously is an internal Sangha matter. So there will be monastic procedures put into place to deal with these kind of issues. So these kind of texts are usually collected in the Vinaya. And there is an entire chapter in a Vinaya text called the Mahavagga, and that whole chapter only deals with the conflict at Kosambi. So we might be reading parts of that. And then there is another genre of texts, which is called Jatakas. And today we are reading a Jataka text. And the one we are reading today is Jataka number 428, the Kosambiya Jataka, or the Jataka about the conflict in Kosambi. And Jatakas are very interesting texts because originally they are not actually Buddhist texts. Originally, they are just ancient Indian folk tales. So they are tales or stories that are much older than Buddhism. They were already considered ancient stories at the time of the Buddha. And they were very popular, very widely known among the population, also among non-Buddhists, in the same way that, for example, in modern times, our ancient fairy tales are known among all the people. This is cultural knowledge and cultural heritage that everybody will know. And in the same way, they had the Jataka stories back then that were pre-Buddhist and much earlier than Buddhism. And in the same way that modern teachers will incorporate modern stories into their Dhamma talks in order to illustrate points and to make it relatable to modern people, because everybody has the same kind of stories in their head, because they're cultural knowledge. In the same way, in the Buddha's time and also after the Buddha's time, people incorporated those old stories into their Dhamma talks. And so over time, they got incorporated into the Buddhist canon. And because they were ancient stories and they were always the hero of the story doing some kind of amazing things, people said these must be past lives of the Buddha, and the hero of that story must be the Buddha in a past life. So over time, all these stories and all the heroes of those stories got associated with the Buddha. And the people around the heroes or other persons in those stories got associated with other famous Buddhist figures. If they were family members of the hero, they would usually be associated with family members of the Buddha, such as his wife, Yasodhara, his son, Rahula, or his parents, and so on. If there was a villain in the story, that was usually identified with Devadatta. And so these are all developments that happened later, but they're all incorporated in the text, in the Jataka text as we have them. And so Jataka texts always have a few features that are characteristic for them. Usually the oldest core of the Jataka is a collection of verses. And then there's also the past life story, which is a prose text, not a verse text. And so this is the ancient Indian folktale, that past life story. And then there's always a prose passage that talks of events at the Buddha's time. So there are events at the Buddha's time, then there's a past life story, and then there are also verses. And then there is the identification of the characters, well, like from the past life story with the life of the Buddha. So these are all very characteristic for Jatakas. I know usually on this channel, we don't really read Jataka stories in the sutta class, we read suttas. But I think most people here on the channel are experienced practitioners, so we can broaden the scope of texts that we read a little bit. So in this series on Buddhist conflict resolution strategies, we are going to read Jatakas and also Vinaya texts in addition to normal sutta texts also. And so today we will read one of these Jatakas, Jataka 428. I have given you a link in the live chat to Sutta Central. And on Sutta Central, there is only one English translation of this Jataka made by Francis and Neil. And this translation is ancient in itself. This was made in the 1890s, so way more than 100 years old. And you will see when you read this translation that they use very ancient terminology. So of course, translations of Buddhist texts have made a lot of progress in the last 130 years or so. And these very early translations, such as the one we are reading today, use a lot of Christian terminology because back then we did not have Buddhist terminology in English established yet. So when they were translating religious content, they had to fall back on Christian terminology. So as we read through this, we will try to replace some of the words with more modern kinds of words to make it easier to understand. But I think this version or this translation is on Sutta Central because it doesn't have copyright, so we can all access this. And for that reason, I am using this translation, even though it is a little bit older. Somebody just posted in the live chat they can't clearly hear me and that we have a connection problem. I'm not sure if that is the case. I hope you can hear me. I tested my microphone, so it should be fine. Maybe there's only one person who has that problem. So hopefully you all can hear me. If not, maybe you can leave a comment in the live chat. But there isn't really much I can do, so I hope it's okay. Oh, somebody, Gita says it's okay now, so that's fine. So let's start reading this Jataka story. Well, the Jataka begins. This story, the master, so the Buddha, while dwelling in the Gosita Park near Kosambi, told concerning the quarrelsome folk at Kosambi. The incident that led to the story is to be found in the section of the Vinaya relating to Kosambi. So as I mentioned, there is a whole chapter in the Vinaya about this Kosambi conflict, and this is what the text here refers to. Here is a short summary of it. At that time, it is said, two brothers, so two bhikkhus, again, this is a Christian terminology, we should say two bhikkhus or two monks, lived in the same house, the one versed in the Vinaya, the other in the sutras. The latter of these, one day, having occasion to visit the lavatory, went out, leaving the surplus water for rinsing the mouth in a vessel. Afterwards, the one versed in the Vinaya went in, and seeing the water, came out and asked his companions if the water had been left by him. He answered, "Yes, sir." So what happened here is one person who was a sutta expert, he went to the bathroom one day, and when he came out, he didn't properly clean up after him. He left a little bit of water in there. And then a Vinaya expert saw this and asked him if it was him who didn't clean up after himself and who left the toilet a little bit messy. And the other monk admitted that it was him. And then the Vinaya expert says, "What? Do you not know that this is an offense?" So the text here says sinful. Again, this is Christian terminology. In modern times, we would say this is an offense. So this is a minor breach of the Vinaya. And the other one says, "No, I was not aware of it." "Well, monk," or "well, bhikkhu, it is an offense. Then I will atone for it." So atone, again, is somewhat Christian. We would, in modern times, we would say, "I will make amends for it," or "I will confess it," or "I will clear the offense." So the Vinaya expert points out that this is actually a breach of the Vinaya. It's a very, very minor breach, but still it's breaking a very small Vinaya rule. But the sutta expert says he wasn't aware of it. So the rule is actually so minor that the sutta expert actually didn't even know that this was a rule. But since now the rule is being pointed out to him, he says he will clear the offense. So he's acting in the proper way at this point. So far, there's not really a conflict. But then the Vinaya expert adds, "But if you did it inadvertently and heedlessly, it is not an offense." So he became as one who saw no offense in what was an offense. So the Vinaya expert then points out that there is an exception to this rule. And if you are not mindful while you're doing it, then you don't break the rule, because this is the exception. You only break the rule if you do it on purpose. If you do it unmindfully, then it's not an offense. And so because the sutta expert thinks he didn't know about the rule, he didn't purposely do it, so he thinks now it's not an offense, so he doesn't need to confess it. But the Vinaya expert actually just pointed this out kind of as a general information, not actually applying this to this particular case. So the Vinaya expert still thinks that this is an offense, while the sutta expert thinks it's not an offense. So you can see how this conflict started. This conflict is really about who didn't clean the toilet properly, and then it got totally out of hand to the point that it created a schism in the sangha. And I think this is, again, very relatable. Usually when we have conflicts in the sangha, or maybe even in daily life, people don't quarrel about, or people don't create massive conflicts about the deep Dhamma teachings and about, very subtle points of doctrine. People quarrel about the small things in daily life that annoy them, or that annoy people, that annoy each other. So who didn't clean the toilet properly, who left their stuff lying around, who made a mess here and there in a community, just the kind of small personality quirks that can be annoying to each other. And these are the things that really create conflicts in communities. And I think this is totally relatable, this story about not cleaning the toilet. This is very, very typical for community life. So then, at this point, the Vinaya scholar said to his pupils, "The sutra scholar, though falling into an offense, is not aware of it." They, on seeing the other monks' pupils, said, "Your master, though falling into an offense, does not recognize its offensiveness." Then they, so the sutra scholar's pupils, went and told their master. And he said, "This Vinaya scholar before said it was no offense, and now he says it is an offense. He is a liar." They went and told the others, "Your master is a liar." Thus they stirred up a quarrel, one with another. So the whole thing escalates, more people get involved, everybody forms their own view, and people who are not actually concerned at all with this issue butt in, and they all start to participate in this conflict, and from a small thing, it develops into this massive issue. And then the Vinaya scholar, finding an opportunity, went through the form of excommunication of the monk for refusing to see his offense. So excommunication, again, isn't really a word we use nowadays. We say expulsion. And you can actually expel other monks or nuns from the sangha. But usually that is only done if it is a really massive problem, a really massive offense, not for some really, really teeny tiny thing, such as this one. So it seems that people got so involved that the whole thing totally went overboard. And then thenceforth, or from then on, even the lay people who provided necessaries or requisites for the monks were divided into two factions. So now the lay people also get involved in the conflict and divide. And the sisterhoods or the bhikkhuni communities too, that accept the admonitions or that get teachings from the monks. And the tutelary gods with their friends and intimates and deities, from those that rest in space to those of the Brahma world. Even all such as were unconverted formed two parties, and the uproar reached to the abode of the sublime gods. So now everybody gets involved. The whole thing spreads. The lay people get involved, the bhikkhunis get involved, even the devas get involved, and everybody is split and is involved in this conflict. So it really, really grew pretty quickly and escalated to a really massive extent. So then a certain monk drew nigh or went to the Tathagata and announced the view of the party who did the expulsion, who said, "The man is expelled in orthodox form," and the view of the followers of the expelled one, who said, "He is illegally expelled," and the practice of those who, though forbidden by the expelling party, still gathered round in support of him. So what happened here now is the Vinaya faction expelled the sutra expert, and they thought that their expulsion procedure was legitimate according to Vinaya. But because expulsion procedures are usually only done for really massive offenses, and this offense is really tiny, if it is an offense at all, the supporters of the sutra monk didn't accept the procedure as legitimate. So they didn't accept the expulsion as legitimate. Usually if we expel a monk, then other monks would not associate with him. If we expel a nun, other nuns would not associate with her. We should keep away. But if the procedure is illegitimate, then the monk or nun isn't really expelled, so we can still be around them and support them. So the sutra monk had this whole community around him who thought that the procedure had not been done in accordance with the Vinaya, so it was illegitimate. And the Blessed One said, "There is a schism." Yes, a schism in the monks' sangha. So the Buddha obviously was very concerned, and he went to them and pointed out the misery involved in expelling to those that expelled, and the misery following upon the concealment of an offense to the opposite party, and so departed. So the first thing the Buddha tries to do in this conflict is that he goes and talks to both sides and points out to each side that what they are doing has led to problems or has led to misery. So to the people who did the expulsion, he pointed out that the expulsion has led to misery and that there are problems with that. And so calls on them to review the way they are acting and review this procedure that they have done. And then he went to the opposite party, to the sutra scholar and his party, and he encouraged him to see that this is an offense and to make amends for this offense. So again, to question their own views and to not stubbornly cling to those views, and to be more lenient and consider making amends for that offense. But he was not successful. Everybody kept clinging to their views. And so when they were holding the Oposita, so the Oposita is the ceremony we do on the full moon and the new moon days when we recite our precepts. So when they did the Oposita in similar service in the same place within the boundary and were quarreling in the refectory and elsewhere, he laid down the rule that they were to sit down together, one by one from each side alternately. So all this community still had to meet together for certain ceremonies and also for the meal services to get the meals. And I think there's a small translation mistake here when we read the Vinaya text about this that was recently translated by Ajahn Brahmali. We see what the Buddha actually laid down is that when they have to be in the same spaces together, then there should be one seat left in between both communities. So what the Buddha is trying to do here is keep the two communities a little bit apart from each other, so that there is so that they're giving each other space and there's less opportunity for them to actually get so close together that they will still continue to quarrel. So they have to do stuff together, but they still should sort of try to avoid clashing as much as possible. So that is what the Buddha is trying to do here. So this is the second thing he tries to do. First, he tries to talk to them and encourage them to let go of their strong view and see the opposite party's view as well. And now he's trying to keep them slightly apart. And hearing that they were still quarreling in the monastery, he went there and said, "Enough, bhikkhus, let us have no quarreling." So at this point, this is the point where he starts teaching them the sutta teachings. So at this point, he's now teaching the Kosambi Sutta. It's not mentioned in the summary that we are reading today, but when we read the Kosambi Sutta, maybe next week, we will see that this is exactly at this point where the sutta picks up. And the Buddha is now starting to give them Dhamma teachings in order to try and get them to see the problem with the way they are behaving. But as he is teaching that sutta, one of the heretical side, not wishing to annoy the Blessed One, said, "Let the Blessed Lord of the Truth stay at home. Let the Blessed One dwell quietly at ease, enjoying the bliss he has already obtained in this life. We shall make ourselves notorious by this quarreling, altercation, disputing, and contention." So the bhikkhus are no longer even interested in listening to the Buddha and no longer even interested in listening to a Dhamma teaching. It has gone to the point where they actually ask the Buddha to leave them alone, where they send the Buddha away, tell the Buddha to stay at home, stay at his own place, and just meditate and enjoy the quiet peace and quiet bliss. And they say themselves that they want to continue quarreling. They're not interested in the Buddha trying to resolve the conflict. So they have become so delusional that they are not even listening to their teacher anymore. And then the Buddha gives them a second teaching. So he's trying with another method. And this time he's teaching the story of Digavu. And now this is the place where we're actually coming to the Indian folk tale, which is now being told, the story of the Prince Digavu. So first the Buddha is giving the Kosambi Sutta, which is a sutta that is somewhat abstract, that appeals to reason, tries to use like rational thinking and logic to convince people. And when that doesn't work, he is resorting to old folk tales. So he's trying to use a more simple method, a method where people can emotionally connect to. An old folk tale is something that is suitable even to teach to children. So anybody should be able to get this point, because he sees the monks are so delusional at this point, they can't even listen to proper Dhamma teachings anymore. So now he's resorting to using some folk tales to teach them. And at this time, the Buddha says, "Once upon a time, monks, Brahmadatta reigned as king of Kasi in Benares. and he robbed Digati, the king of Kosala, of his kingdom and put him to death when living in disguise. And when Prince Digavu spared the life of Brahmadatta, they became thenceforth close friends. So obviously here, this is again a summary. The whole story of Prince Digavu is not told in this Jataka. This whole story is again told in the Vinaya. And this is a very extensive Dhamma teaching that the Buddha gives about non-conflict. And this is what we are probably going to read after we have studied the Kosambi Sutta. So it's coming up in our series of talks. Just briefly to explain what is happening in this story is that two kings quarrel with each other, Brahmadatta and Digati. And this is set a long time in the past. So in Jatakas, a very common introduction to a Jataka is when Brahmadatta was king of Kasi. And Brahmadatta isn't really a historical king. He is a mythological king. And this expression is used in the same way that in Western fairy tales, we use the expression once upon a time. So once upon a time also doesn't mean at some point in history. It just means like a mythological time, a long time ago, without any specific historical time attached. In the same way, Jatakas use the expression when Brahmadatta was king of Kasi to say a long time in the past, without actually meaning that this really happened in history. So those two kings, Brahmadatta and Digati, go to war. Brahmadatta wins. Digati has to flee. He and his wife and his son become refugees and they live in disguise. And after many, many years, when the prince, the prince Digavu has grown up and has become a young adult, they are found out and Brahmadatta then kills Digati and the queen. And Prince Digavu is very distressed about his parents having been killed. And so he wants to take revenge. And so he enters the services of King Brahmadatta. He becomes very close to him. He becomes a very close advisor. And when Brahmadatta starts to trust him and is alone with him, Digavu has the opportunity to kill Brahmadatta. And at this point, then Digavu reflects and he figures that because he's full of hatred for his parents having been killed, but if he gives into that hatred and kills himself, then the cycle of violence will never end. So he figures out that violence can only be overcome and this vicious circle can only be broken if you practice loving kindness or friendliness or metta instead of hate. So he spares the life of Brahmadatta and the two of them become close friends. And so this whole story is a teaching of how to overcome hatred or anger or violence with loving kindness. That's the whole point of this story. And then the Buddha continues here and says, and since such must have been the long-suffering and tenderness of these sceptered and sword-bearing kings, verily, because you ought to make it clear that you too, having embraced the religious life, according to so well-taught a doctrine and discipline, can be forgiving and tender-hearted. So the Buddha says, if even those kings are able to overcome their hatred and their enmity after all the killing that has happened, then you people, you bhikkhus who are monastics who have gone forth, who are practicing a spiritual life and who have these lofty aspirations, how much more should you be able to practice loving kindness and forgiveness and being tender-hearted? So how much more should you be able to resolve this conflict and to stop clinging to your particular view? And thus admonishing them for the third time, he said, enough, bhikkhus, let there be no quarreling. And when he saw that they did not cease at his bidding, he went away saying, verily, these foolish folk are like men possessed. They are not easy of persuasion. So even at this point, even though the Buddha has given them such an easy teaching, he is giving them this folk tale, this really easy to understand story that is not at all complicated. Still, he doesn't get through to them. And still they cling to their views and still they continue quarreling. So the Buddha has tried different strategies at this point and nothing has worked. So the Buddha chooses another path of action. And the next day, returning from the collection of alms, he rested a while in his perfumed chamber, so in the Ganda Kuti, his personal kuti. And then he put his room in order, and then taking his bowl and robe, he stood poised in the air and delivered these verses in the midst of the assembly. So here, when the text says he puts his room in order and takes his bowl and robe, that's a sign that he's preparing to depart. So he has decided to no longer stay with those quarreling monks. He's basically giving up on them for the moment, and he's decided to go elsewhere, away from the conflict. So he's just, he can't do anything. He's tried everything he could. He was tried teaching them in various ways, and now he decides to leave them behind. And now he's giving them this long collection of verses, or this poem here about non-conflict. And this poem is very, very famous. These verses occur in other places in the canon. The entire sutta reoccurs in the Upakilesa Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 128. As I mentioned, we are going to read this in the course of this series of talks. So we can go through this a little bit quickly today. Most of these verses also reoccur in the Dhammapada, and they're very famous because they deal with conflict management and deal with overcoming hatred through love. So very beautiful teaching in here. And as I mentioned, these verses or poems are what is at the heart of every Jataka story. So there's no Jataka without a verse. And so this is basically the most important thing. The most important teaching of a Jataka is always the verse. So let's go through this a little bit quickly, since we are going to talk about this again in the future. But it's a very beautiful poem. And the Buddha says here, whenever the brotherhood or the monk's sangha in twain is rent, the common folk to loudmouth cries give vent. Each one believes that he himself is wise and views his neighbor with disdainful eyes. Bewildered souls, puffed up with self-esteem, with open mouth they foolishly blaspheme. And as through all the range of speech they stray, they know not whom as leader to obey. This man abused me, that struck me a blow. A third overcame and robbed me long ago. All such as harbor feelings of this kind, to mitigate their wrath, are never inclined. He did abuse and buffet me of yore, he overcame me and oppressed me sore. They who such thoughts refuse to entertain, appease their wrath and live as one again. So basically, the Buddha is describing the situation here, people being enmeshed in conflict. And as long as people keep on thinking about all the wrongs that were done to them in the past and keep on clinging to these thoughts of violence and harboring all this anger, they will never be able to overcome the conflict. But if they don't think in this way, if they don't over and over recount all the abuse they had to endure in the past, and let go of all these thoughts, at this point, they can let go of the anger and live in harmony again, live at one again. And then the Buddha continues, not hate, but love alone makes hate to cease. This is the everlasting law of peace. Some men the law of self-restraint despise, but who make up their quarrels, they are wise. If men all scarred with wounds in deadly strife, reavers and robbers taking human life, nay, those that plunder a whole realm may be friends with their foes, should bhikkhus not agree. So the Buddha says, even robbers and criminals can agree with each other, so why can't bhikkhus live in harmony together? Shouldst thou a wise and honest comrade find, a kindred soul to dwell with thee inclined, all dangers past with him, though still wouldst stray, in happy contemplation all the day. But shouldst thou fail to meet with such a friend, thy life 'twere best in solitude to spend, like to some prince that abdicates a throne, or elephant that ranges all alone. For choice adopt the solitary life, companionship with fools but leads to strife. In careless innocence, pursue thy way, like elephant in forest, wild astray. So the Buddha says here in the last 3 verses, if you find a friend that is wise and honest, then you should stay with them together and practice together. And if you don't find such a person, then it's best to be in solitude rather than being with fools who create all these conflicts. And then he puts his own teaching into practice and decides not to stay with the fools that quarrel and practice in solitude for the time being. So the Buddha actually goes away and leaves them behind. And when the master had thus spoken, as he failed to reconcile these bhikkhus, he went to Balakalona. So this passage is now also explained in a lot more detail in the Upakilesa Sutta, which we're going to read. The Buddha is trying one last time to reconcile the monks at Kosambi. When this fails, he goes away. He goes to the village of Balakalunakara, or the village of Balaka, the salt maker. So Balaka is the name of a person, then Lona means salt, and Kara means making, and Gama, of course, means village. And in that village, he meets the Venerable Bhagu. So he discoursed to the Venerable Bhagu of the blessings of solitude, because Bhagu is living there alone and enjoying his life very much and making a lot of progress in his practice. And thence, or from there, he repaired to the abode of the 3 youths of gentle birth and spoke to them of the bliss to be found in the sweets of concord. So the 3 youths of gentle birth, these are also mentioned in the Upakilesa Sutta. These are Anuruddha, Nandya, and Kimbila, the 3 monks that live in harmony together. This is where the expression blending like milk and water comes from, and the expression of viewing each other with kindly eyes. And they have the ideal community life, and in the Upakilesa Sutta, their harmonious living together is described in a lot of detail and contrasted with the conflict at Kosambi. And because they practice so well, or because they live together in harmony, they can practice well and their meditation really improves. And the Buddha gives them this teaching on the subtle kilesas, the upakilesas, or the subtle defilements, in this Upakilesa Sutta. And from there, the Buddha journeyed to the Parilayaka forest, and after dwelling there for 3 months without returning to Kosambi, he went straight to Savatthi. So the story of the Parilayaka forest also is very famous, especially, I think, in traditional Buddhist countries. This is a story also found in the Vinaya. It's a story also found in the Udana collection. And there the Buddha is on retreat for 3 months in the forest, and he is served by an elephant. And that's why the story is so popular, because that elephant there serves him like normally a human being would. So for a bhikkhu or the Buddha here to live alone in the wilderness, there needs to be somebody who offers food, for example, so that the bhikkhu can, or the Buddha can keep the Vinaya. And so this elephant takes on that role and is offering food to the Buddha and is doing all the chores. So that's why this story became quite famous. And maybe we will also read this story in our in our course or our few sessions. It's a very, very cute little story, very famous in traditional Buddhist countries. And from there, the Buddha doesn't even go back to Kosambi, he goes straight to Savatthi. So now is the description of how the conflict actually got resolved. And at this point, the lay folk in Kosambi consulted together and said, surely these reverend bhikkhus of Kosambi have done us much harm. Worried by them, the Blessed One is gone away. We will neither offer salutation nor offer marks of respect to them, nor give alms to them when they visit us. So they will depart or return to the world, or will propitiate the Blessed One. And they did so. So This conflict eventually got resolved, not by the monks finally letting go of their views and coming back to reason, not by the Buddha teaching, giving deep Dhamma talks, not by the Buddha doing anything extraordinary, but it's actually the lay people who forced this conflict to be resolved. So the lay people were finally fed up with all the fighting, and they didn't feel inspired by the Sangha anymore at all. So they consulted together, and they were upset because the Buddha had left because of the conflict, so they no longer got to see the Buddha. So they decided to no longer pay respect to the monks, and also, and this is probably the more important thing, no longer to feed the monks. So as most of you are probably familiar, monks cannot cook for themselves. They cannot grow their own food. They are dependent on the lay community for their survival, for their daily meal. And so the lay people decided to no longer offer meals to the monks. And with the assumption that if they do so, the monks will either go somewhere else, or they will disrobe, or they will go to the Buddha and reconcile. And their plan did succeed. Once the monks became hungry, they figured out that after all, it wasn't that important to figure out who didn't clean the toilet properly. And after all, it's a pretty small matter. So they did come back to their senses once they were hungry, and decided to go back to the Buddha and ask for forgiveness. So here, as the text says, these brothers, or these monks, overwhelmed by this form of punishment, went to Savatthi and begged forgiveness of the Blessed One. So at this point, again, in the Vinaya, there are a lot of ideas on how to manage a conflict at this point. So there's the question, if the Sangha is quarreling, or generally if people are quarreling, how should the rest of the community relate to this? How should the lay people relate to this? How should the bhikkhunis relate to this? How should the monks relate to this that are not involved in the conflict? So the Sangha at large. And so there are instructions of the Buddha how to deal with these conflicts if we're not directly involved, if we're not directly one of the parties, but it still somehow concerns us. And we still have to find some way of dealing with the people that are involved. So there are provisions for that. And then there are also provisions of how to manage that reconciliation. Because sometimes if people want to reconcile, still it's not that easy, because there are so many emotions involved and so much hurt from all sides. So even if they want to reconcile, it's sometimes not really easy to know how to practically go about that. And so the Buddha set some precedents, and he established some procedures how to manage that skillfully and how to reconcile these people again at this point. So these are all provisions in the Vinaya, and we'll probably have a look at these ones at some point as well. And then the Jataka ends, as usual, with the identification of the people from the past life story with people from the Buddha's time. So the master thus identified the birth, the father. So the father here is the King Digati. The father was the great King Suddhodana, the mother was Mahamaya, and Prince Digavu was myself. So the hero of the past life story, Prince Digavu, who decided to overcome hatred with loving kindness, that's obviously the Buddha. And then the Prince Digavu's parents, so King Digati and the queen, who were killed by King Brahmadatta, those are identified with the Buddha's parents in the Buddha's last life, so King Suddhodana and Mahamaya. This is very typical for a Jataka, that the family relations of the hero in the past life story are the same as the Buddha's in the Buddha's last life. So this is the end of the Jataka here. As you can see, this is a very short overview of the conflict. There is a lot of things that are here that we can study. All the beautiful suttas, Kosambi Sutta, Upakilesa Sutta, the story of the Prince Digavu, and then the various Vinaya procedures that the Buddha has put into place here. So these are all things that we want to have a look at in the next few weeks. And I think this conflict is just so relatable because it's just so down to earth. People are there having good intentions, wanting to put the Dhamma into practice, and then starting to quarrel over a really, really minor thing. And this is just something that happens in daily life all the time. And then people are trying various strategies to reconcile. And eventually, it's the lay people putting into place some very practical restrictions, such as not giving any more food, which forces the conflict to be resolved and which makes people see reason again. So I think the whole story is just extremely relatable. And I hope that you're looking forward to studying this, because I think there's just so many beautiful teachings that are also very applicable to daily life. So at this point, I think I'm going to end the Sutta study or the Jataka study for today. And if you have any kinds of questions, you can type them in the live chat, and I will try my best to see if I can answer them. So Buddha Ruchi says, sad to think that these monastics so thoroughly exposed to the Dhamma just don't get it. Wow, it goes to show us just how dangerous our views can be. I think sometimes we have the view that people who are Dhamma practitioners have to be so amazing and so perfect already. And especially in this case, because these are a Sutta expert and a Vinaya expert. So they are experts in a certain field. They obviously have studied for many, many years. They have a large following. They all have a lot of students, which means that they must have been ordained for quite a while in order to be able to take on students. So the Vinaya requires that you have at least 10 years of seniority before you start training. So clearly, these were very senior and very respected members of the community, and still they couldn't see what they were doing, and they allowed this really minor thing to be blown so much out of proportion. And yeah, it also shows like the danger of clinging very tightly to very minor things, such as, you know, the right way of cleaning something, or how to arrange something in a Dhamma center, or how to manage certain matters that are actually very minor, but people can get really worked up about all these details. So I think these are things we encounter in our daily life all the time. And when that happens, we can reflect on why this affects us so much, and how much we are attached to what we think is the right way of doing these kind of things. So yeah, monastics also aren't perfect. And of course, living together in communities is very difficult, especially in monastic circles, because we don't really pick the people we are living with. Like, if you live in a family, usually you've chosen your partner, and usually you have a loving relationship with your children, or with your parents, or the people that you live with. In monastic circles, like, people of very different characters join the sangha, and you don't really have that much control over who you live with. It's not necessarily a person you would have chosen as your best friend or as your life partner if you were a layperson and if you were living a worldly life. So you have to learn to live together with a lot of very different characters. And that can also be a challenge, and that can also be part of the monastic training, to manage to establish harmonious relations with all kinds of people. And at times that can be really difficult, and so small things can get out of hand to the point like what we've seen here in this sutta. And Sud asks, so should one make loving kindness their primary practice? I'm actually shocked monks can quarrel after knowing Buddha's teachings. Yeah, I think I just addressed the question of why monastics still quarrel. But should one make loving kindness their primary practice? it depends very much on the circumstances. Like if you are enmeshed in such a conflict in that particular moment, then certainly loving kindness would be very, very helpful. So when we do Dhamma practice, it's always very good to practice what is called sampajanya, or situational awareness, where we figure out what is the situation that we are in at the moment. Also, what is occupying our mind at that particular day, or that particular meditation session, or that particular stretch of time, whether that's a day or an hour or a month, it doesn't really matter. Just check in with what's going on at that particular moment, and don't just automatically do the same practice all the time. So at some point, you might have a lot of anger in your mind because you're in the middle of this conflict, or even you're just a bystander and watching that conflict, but somehow getting affected. Then loving kindness definitely is a very important practice to do. At some point, like at other times, then you might have other situations and other defilements in your mind. In that case, other kinds of practices might be more helpful. So let's say you have a lot of greed in your mind, then a good practice would be contentment or letting go or renunciation, not necessarily loving kindness. Or if you have a lot of restlessness in your mind, a good practice would be something that's calming. Or if you have a lot of sluggishness, if you're very tired, then a good practice is something that would be rising your energy level. So loving kindness is very good for conflictive situations, or situations where you have a lot of anger or hatred or ill will. In other situations, practice other methods. So it's good to have a wide range of methods available so that you can do whatever is necessary in that particular situation. And Gita says, elephant and monkey is serving the Buddha. So this refers to the Parilayaka incident. So in the suttas, the main person, or the main animal serving the Buddha is the elephant. I also know that the monkey is there, and the monkey is also serving. I know this story. I think the story with the monkey is a little bit later. It's probably found more in the commentaries than the suttas and the Vinaya itself. But the story with the elephant is also found in the suttas and the Vinaya. And Gita says, very famous story. Yes, Gita is obviously from Sri Lanka. And as I mentioned, in the traditional Buddhist countries, this story is super famous. And Gita has another question about what happened after the Buddha's parinibbana. So this is a very lengthy question. Let me just see how many other questions are still there. Okay, we have quite a few more comments and questions, so I'll give a brief answer. It is traditionally very often believed that the different schools as we have them today were caused by conflicts, or were caused by actual schisms or splits in the Sangha. There's actually no evidence for there being actual schisms or disagreements or conflicts, and that caused the emergence of schools. So we know there were disagreements in the doctrines. We know that they were practicing slightly different vinayas. Probably the major factor for the development of different schools is that Buddhism spread out over a very big geographical area, especially at the time of King Ashoka. So King Ashoka lived around 150 to 200 years after the Buddha's parinibbana. And maybe even 300 years. We're not quite clear on the exact dates because we don't exactly know. There's disagreement on when exactly the Buddha entered Mahaparinibbana. So we know exactly when King Ashoka lived, but we don't exactly know when the Buddha entered Mahaparinibbana. So there is a little bit of an insecurity there, but definitely at the time of King Ashoka, Ashoka sent out a lot of missionaries to the various countries around India. So Buddhism suddenly spread out over a vast geographical area, and it was difficult to keep communications up. I mean, there were still wandering monks and nuns traveling around, but the communications were much more difficult than when Buddhism had covered a much smaller area. So regional differences developed, and the cohesion was much smaller after that. So because regional differences developed, naturally regional schools evolved. And then people had different ideas about Vinaya, people had different ideas about doctrine, but it's not clear that that actually led to a schism in the sense of the Vinaya. So for a schism to happen, some very specific situations need to happen. For example, the sangha needs to carry out their uposatha within the same boundary, within, let's say, the same monastery, in two different factions. So most monastics would be very, very reluctant to do that because of the belief that if you make a schism, if you create a schism, you might be reborn in hell. And the way to avoid a schism in that case is to just for one group to go to another place outside the boundary and do their ceremonies there. And in that case, it's not a schism. So you don't incur the heavy karma of splitting the sangha. So it's very unlikely that the formal schisms in the sense of the Vinaya would actually have happened, because monastics are really very reluctant to do that. And because there's a very easy way to avoid this by going to another place. So definitely there were differences in the doctrine, there were differences in the Vinaya, but probably it wasn't really a formal schism in the sense of the Vinaya that happened. And probably the schools emerged more because of geographical differences and so on, and because of textual differences. So this is a very brief overview. I should go into a lot more detail. Yeah, there are so many more questions, so I think I'll just move on. Yeah, so Dan says, I came to Dhamma first of all because years ago there was a conflict in a housing cooperative I was involved in, and I had no idea what I could do. In the end, it was metta. So this is what I mean, like, these conflicts are very relatable. We experience them all the time in our daily lives. Metta is a very good practice for ourselves. Like, the first thing we should do is protect ourselves. As the Buddha says here in that poem that we read, or that verse, that's a series of verses, hatred is only overcome with friendliness, with metta, or with love, depending on how you want to translate. And that's a practice we can do for ourselves, to protect ourselves, and that helps ourselves. Whether that helps others, it depends on whether the others are also willing to take on that practice or not. But first and foremost, we can help ourselves. And as the Buddha also said, sometimes it's better to take ourselves out of the situation, the same way that the Buddha took himself out of the situation, and practice alone for a while. And either those people eventually come back to their senses and reconcile, or you just find other people to practice with. But yeah, metta is very important to practice in that kind of situation, just to protect ourselves. And if everybody practices metta, then it's very easy to resolve such a conflict. And Amaranta says, thank you, Aya. I find very close to me this story. I attach a point of view and try to justify it. Yeah, I think that's how conflicts usually develop. For some reason, we have a point of view and we think this is the only right view. And then we justify it and we cling to it. And it's very difficult for us to see the things from the perspective of the other person. So this is also a very good practice we can do. When there is a conflict, we try to see things from the perspective of the other one. Try to understand what kind of reasoning they apply, what kind of arguments they have, why they would be attached to that, what kind of emotions would be playing into that, trying to understand their background, their situation. And this is a good practice we can do even when there's no conflict, just to prepare our mind to be able to take up different points of view. And so we don't cling very tightly to one particular view. This is a supplementary practice, also very good in addition to metta. And And then Dan Jones says, recently it was about saying a smell existed before a certain time. Meditation is done in the community. So I guess there was a conflict about a smell and whether or not that was there. So it seems like another very small thing that can cause conflicts. And then also continues and says, what to do if someone you live with harbors some fault with you and you say hi and they cannot even bring themselves to say hi. All I have is practice metta. When do we go alone and move on? So yeah, the first thing is to protect your own mind, practicing metta, not letting anger arise. Also, is this person really, really that important to you? Like, do you have to get along with them well? If so, then of course that might be a problem. If it's just a neighbor and they ignore you, then what can you do? People are different, and if they don't want to be in contact with you, then just accept that and try to find other friends to be with. So some people are difficult, and we don't have to change everybody. We just look after our own mind. So just accept that not everybody wants to be friendly with you, and if people want to do their own thing, then that's fine too. And if they cling to their anger, if they're angry with you and cling to that, then there's very little you can do if they don't want to change. Just in the same way that the Buddha tried over and over to teach the monks with various strategies, but they were so clingy to their view that they didn't even listen to the Buddha, and the Buddha couldn't do anything, and the Buddha just left. So sometimes we just have to accept that there are limits to what we can do. So practice metta to protect yourself. Keep on being friendly to that person, but don't get too much involved. And if you really cannot avoid that person and they're really angry and hostile, you can always choose to go somewhere else. So I think you have to decide for yourself at which point it's time for you to move on. Usually that's when you feel that your anger is too overwhelming and you can't really practice properly, and your metta just isn't strong enough to prevent you from constantly cultivating anger and cultivating those negative mind states. And of course, those negative mind states, they're also mental actions. So they're creating karma for you. And if you're constantly creating all this negative karma, then this might be a good time to move on if you find that your practice isn't strong enough to remain cheerful and friendly and equanimous. And Claudia says, how much is maybe not this minor issue is the reason for the conflict, but maybe the animosity between the sutta experts and the Vinaya experts? Yeah, of course, that could also be an issue. People thinking that their own way of practice is the best way and looking down on others. So people who study sutras think sutta study is the most important thing, and people who study Vinaya think Vinaya is the most important thing. And then they already have a superiority conflict and look down on the others. And when the others make a mistake, you really start to, pick on that and blow it out of proportion and really show it to everybody and point it out all the time just to feed your own complex of superiority. So that is probably something that played into this as well, especially if you remember in the story, at first it was only the two experts talking to each other and still being reasonably friendly with each other. But once their students got involved, the whole thing blew totally out of proportion. So people who are not really directly involved in the conflict start to butt in and start to use this as an excuse to fight with each other. And then the whole thing is really just an excuse. Like they were just looking for a reason to start criticizing each other and to start fighting. And if that is the case, obviously, then it doesn't matter what happened. Like any tiny spark will ignite this conflict, and it's just being used as a pretext. And one last question from Ivy, and they say, how should one behave if a bhikkhu shows their annoyance at oneself? So I think if a bhikkhu is annoyed with the layperson, how should the layperson behave? I think that is the question, hopefully. So hopefully that doesn't happen all too often, unless the layperson really behaved in a very inappropriate way towards the monastic. Hopefully the monastic wouldn't just be annoyed with the layperson for no reason. But if that happens, well, same thing you do with any other person, I guess, whether that's a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni or a layperson. If there is a person that is very annoyed with yourself, then first thing is to protect your own mind, not to let anger arise. Practice metta or practice equanimity, one of the Brahma Viharas, or even practice compassion for the other person, because the person who gets annoyed with you, they are suffering. They are having all this anger in their mind. That's a very uncomfortable mind state. And obviously they're creating very bad karma at this point. Bad mental actions, bad karma. So compassion is also a good practice. So one of the Brahma Viharas you can practice to protect your own mind. And you can also check yourself. Did I do something wrong? If I do something wrong, don't beat yourself up, but just learn from it and don't do it again in the future. Otherwise, if it's totally unjustified and the person just got angry with you for no reason, you don't really have to be concerned. The anger is really in the other person's mind. So as long as you can protect your own mind, and as long as you don't create negative karma through your own actions, through your own speech, or in your own mind, you really don't have to worry that much. If it's really uncomfortable for you, you can always go away and go to another place. But it doesn't really matter too much whether the person that's angry with you is a monastic or a lay person. So that was the last comment or question for today. I think we can end our sutta class for today. Next week, I think probably we will start reading one of the suttas, very likely the Kosambi Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 48, which has those very beautiful and very unique teachings of the Buddha on communal harmony and on stream entry. So I hope you're looking forward to that. Otherwise, I wish you a really good day and a good rest of the week. And I hope to see you all next week. And we will end for today with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join in if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. See you all next week.